In this, the penultimate entry in Existence, our retrospective on Metal Gear Solid 2, will begin to close out by considering an undervalued contribution by the game, its insights into the crises of the near future, which will not be only terroristic in nature, but also economic and ecological. Metal Gear Solid 2's opening chapter, Tanker, as well as its main scenario, Plant, both place the world of petro power on the periphery. By appearances, the game opens on what looks like a crude oil tanker, and continues on what resembles an offshore oil rig. Oil is everywhere in Sons of Liberty, both literally and figuratively just beneath the surface. And even if most of the actual oil spill story turns out to be fake, officially the game's events are kicked off by such a spill, and really get started to prevent a further act of eco-terrorism. We're told at the start of the Plant chapter that the remaining oil in the lower Manhattan harbor will create a chemical cocktail once ignited by the terrorists, alongside the chlorides present from the so-called Big Shell's cleanup operation, to become possibly the greatest ecological disaster in history. At the end of the game, we're told in a cinematic voiceover atop the lapping waves near Ellis Island that most likely someday the existence of the human race will come to an end.
シナリオが2本動いていまして、最初の段階で、タンカーではなかったです。空母編っていうものが最初に、考えて、空母編といわゆる移動する、閉鎖空間というか、そういうのがまずやりたかったと、それだけではちょっと物足らないということで、同時にもう一つそのプラントっていう海上施設っていう、前作はアラスカでしたけども、今回はその海の上に立つ、ある種の閉鎖空間っていうのを、設定して、でその2つのお話が同時に走ってたんですけども、でどっちを取ろうかっていう時にその2つを融合させた結果になりました。
So all along the duration of MGS2, in other words, we're softly yet repeatedly hitting upon the topic of the environment and the rise of what scientists today are calling the age of the Anthropocene. The age of the Anthropocene, to quote National Geographic, refers to the current geologic period in Earth's history when human activity has started to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. Now, as of 2001, the year MGS2 debuted, information on climate change was still being widely suppressed. Suppressed by who? Oil companies like Exxon. According to Scientific American, climate change first entered public consciousness around the year 1988. Exxon, meanwhile, was aware of the issue a full 11 years prior, in 1977. So why didn't they say anything? Well, first, let's be specific about what they actually knew. Exxon senior scientist James Black told the company internally in 1977 that, quote, general scientific agreement exists that the most likely manner mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels, end quote. And in 1978, he reported doubling CO2 gases in the atmosphere would increase average global temperatures by 2 or 3 degrees. Quote, present thinking holds man has a window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes to energy strategies might become critical, end quote. Now, Scientific American points out the research Exxon did on this matter at the time was extensive. They knew what was coming possibly better than anyone else. So what happened? And more importantly, what does it have to do with Metal Gear Solid 2? Well, the oil industry is no ordinary industry. It is the very basis by which America maintains its importance and its power. both economically and politically, on the world stage. As I covered much earlier on in this series, Richard Nixon nixed the gold standard and informally tethered the US dollar to the global oil business in the early 1970s. This entire New World Order, as George H. Bush dubbed it in 1991, was built on the back of the beast slouching towards Bethlehem we call the petrodollar. If demand for oil disappeared overnight, America would lose its trump card and would have to start seriously competing internationally again. The only reason things like education and inequality have become non-issues in America is because ever since the Second World War, we have acclimated essentially to outsourcing everything in our system that only runs thanks to our monopoly over petrol politics. In an increasingly technological era, the US has become more dependent upon oil-based products to help us maintain our high standard of living. Understanding Oil Spills and Oil Spill Response, the Environmental Protection Agency, December 1999. This is a complex economic subject, largely relating to the rise of credit unions and financial institutions, both domestically and via Patriot-esque entities to some extent, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. In the Global Minotaur, Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis explains that the 2008 Great Recession was actually set into motion inadvertently alongside the shift to the petrodollar in the 1970s. There's a poetic, grim irony in the way that the word risk in the following passage from Varoufakis' book could just as readily apply to the risk of climate change. Varoufakis writes that the advent of technologically driven innovation, quote, lulled authorities and academics into thinking that risk had been engineered out of the system. Loans were blended together in packages that contained different degrees of risk and sold all over the globe. This was a new age faith in the financial sector's power to create riskless risk, culminating in the belief that the planet could now sustain debts and bets made on the back of these debts that were many multiples of actual global income. End quote. This new economic model was the only game in town, and for globally poorer societies, if this system of modernization was heaven, debt, dollars, and oil were that heaven's holy trinity. Just ask John Perkins, former self-styled economic hitman. He defined this occupation back in 1982 as follows, quote, economic hitmen are highly paid professionals who cheat countries around the globe out of trillions of dollars. They funnel money from the World Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and other foreign aid organizations into the coffers of huge corporations and the pockets of a few wealthy families who control the planet's natural resources. They have played a game as old as empire, but one that has taken on new and terrifying dimensions during this time of globalization. End quote. Much as the Patriots do our thinking for us, economic hitmen, in tandem with petropolitics, have kept America on top for us, or rather, for our elites, our corporations. Though the rise of climate change and the era of the Anthropocene have made the extinction of this system all but inevitable, it remains to be seen whether we can do enough to save the planet. And whether or not even in this we'll be stuck turning for help to the very architects and power players that built this endless, global, smoke-belching city in the first place. Metal Gear Solid has always been a cautionary tale on the horrors of nuclear weapons. Well, Mark Linus writes in Our Final Warning that, quote, in just over a century of unbridled fossil fuel use, humanity has returned atmospheric CO2 concentrations to levels last seen in the Pliocene, around 3 to 5 million years ago. 6 zettajoules of energy are accumulating in the upper oceans every year. 6 zettajoules of energy equates to the same amount of heat as 3 Hiroshima atomic bombs exploding in the ocean every second. Count them. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. And that's only the result of CO2 emissions generally. What about the ecological effects of oil spills? Another central topic for MGS2. Well, at the opening of plant, what we're seeing dispersed all around within the water as Rhydon infiltrates is so-called marine snow. Marine snow is bacteria that falls from the upper expanses of the ocean to the lower floor as part of a natural cycle known as the biological pump. In the event of an oil spill, marine snow can actually eat the oil by breaking up the substance's hydrocarbons, though it can't eat it completely. To accelerate this process, oil companies like BP have deployed dispersants like Corexit. Again, there's a certain poetry to this. To quote Chemistry World and the CEO of bioremediation product producer Oil Spill Eater International, dispersants only hide the problem. The full environmental impact of dispersants on the ocean as a complex, large-scale ecosystem, writes science historian Ian Stewart, is difficult to model or predict. But, quoting Chemistry World again, although dispersants have come to be seen as a politically acceptable solution, the oil is still there, it's just no longer on the surface. End quote. But what is bioremediation? In MGS2, we're told the sea lice present on the big shell were genetically modified to eat oil.
Look at all these bugs. The seawater is polluted with crude oil, and yet they can still survive.
It's an altered bug that can resolve crude oil.
Altered?
Yes, through genetic engineering. It was created in the lab to combat frequent oil spills. It doesn't exist naturally. The bug is genetically altered with DNA from a bacteria called Pseudomonas, which can decompose crude oil. It has an enzyme in its body that can break up oil, and was modified so it instinctively consumes any crude oil that it absorbs. One of the reasons the big shell has little oil pollution is because of this bug. It also helps in reducing costs and the number of spill maintenance workers. It's a form of bioremediation.
That's a particularly advanced form of bioremediation, which according to Science World is any process that uses decomposers, green plants, and related bacteria or enzymes to improve the conditions of contaminated environments, end quote. Now, Sons of Liberty note features prominently seagulls. Famously, the birds in the game even have their own AI routines, according to Giant Bomb. They're important symbols for the dangers of a poisoned ecosystem, though.
I see a lot of birds over there. The tanker accident 2 years ago released crude oil containing massive quantities of endocrine disruptors. The fish that absorbed them were then eaten by seagulls, which further concentrated the endocrine disruptors in their bodies. What sort of outcome this will lead to is still currently under review and is yet unclear. It just goes to show that finishing the cleanup of ocean oil spills does not mean that environmental restoration efforts end there as well.
Both from contact with the water itself and from consuming contaminated prey, seagulls and other seabirds spread oil contamination over the sky. Though MGS2 utilizes this systemic pollution as a metaphor for the contaminating effects of unfiltered information, we shouldn't overlook the literal danger also played by such disasters as oil spills as a topic of major concern for MGS2. One possible real-world disaster to have influenced MGS2 on this point was the Greenpoint oil spill, a disaster that also illustrates the close bond over the years between petroleum and the so-called American century. Branching out from the Hudson River, the Newtown Creek is a winding tributary that's become one of the most well-used waterways in New York City. In the 19th century, this area became a hotbed of oil refinement, at the same time that the wider port of New York and New Jersey was starting to become one of the world's busiest, thanks to increasing American dominance in world trade. Soon, the creek grew into an important industrial waterway, and like most places that industrialize, it quickly became polluted. Not only from refineries, but from bulk oil storage plants, Newtown Creek quickly became a polluted disaster zone. In 1978, a U.S. Coast Guard discovered the infamous oil spill that would continue polluting the soil and wider region for 30 years. As the Newtown Creek Alliance writes, the oil spill is not the result of one distinct event, but the toxic culmination of 140 years of spillage. Between 17 and 30 million gallons, the oil plume from the spill was estimated to course below 55 acres of Greenpoint industrial, commercial, and residential property, affecting hundreds of homes and dozens of businesses." End quote. It was the same era at the turn of the century when Rockefeller was building Standard Oil and setting into motion what would become the Greenpoint spill that Manhattan itself was being transformed into the sprawling, many-bridged metropolis of the modern imagination. The George Washington Bridge, for example, was built by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, who would later also build the Twin Towers. It's this mythic Manhattan that MGS2 would have originally referred to with the name MGS numeral 3. The 3 would have symbolized the city's largest skyscrapers, including the World Trade Center and the Empire State. It would have been this Manhattan, this symbolic New York, that Fortune's wing of Dead Cell in the events of the game wanted to wipe off the face of the Earth. You could even argue that the scenarios in Sons of Liberty that involve escaping from rapidly rising or changing levels of water are themselves hints towards the theme of climate change. After all, the Titanic sank after it struck an iceberg. The polar ice caps are melting today thanks to the impact of the age of oil and industrialization. It's not for nothing the big shell itself somewhat resembles a factory, one full of construction cranes and conveyor belts. Even Otacon's mission, while you and Snake infiltrate Arsenal gear to evac the hostages before disaster strikes and they're all drowned in the coming flood, may be a nod to what will become a major crisis in the near future, evacuating civilians from coastal regions worldwide, which, within a century, likely will be underwater. Of course, MGS2 didn't lay out an uncomplicated view of ecological issues or humanitarianism. Often the very humanitarians and philanthropists who fundraise to save the planet are themselves deeply wrapped up in the real underlying problem, which is, to my mind, the predominance of class.
Politics, the military, the economy, they control it all. They even choose who becomes president. Putting it simply, the Patriots rule this country.
As the Patriots mock American society for, millions of dollars go to preserve and sustain certain animals like whales, while actual human American citizens starve to death on the street. The legal system in America has fostered the growth of what Ankush Kardori, writing in the New York Review of Books, calls not the rule of law, but the rule by law. A system that allows wealthy participants and the government to exploit it, all to the detriment and disadvantage of the less well-off and their less well-paid attorneys. This same rule by law system has allowed corporations and institutions to totally evade responsibility for issues relating to climate change. For example, until as recently as 2019, the World Bank could not be sued when, to quote NPR, their investments in foreign development projects are alleged to have caused harm to local communities, end quote. The same article points out that more than 3 million people across every continent have been physically or economically displaced by World Bank-funded projects over the past decade alone, end quote. If you'll notice, the US economy is very badly in debt and has been for some time. According again to the Global Minotaur, this goes back to the Vietnam War, if not to World War II. How did America remain the leading capitalist power in the wake of squandering the legacy of the Second World War? By constructing, the Global Minotaur tells us, a global system that financed the US's deficits with the rest of the world's surpluses, famously christened by Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 87 Paul Volcker, a controlled disintegration in the world economy. To quote a 1999 issue of Executive Intelligence Review, Vulture's policy of controlled disintegration was a cornerstone of a policy shift to put into place the paradigm of a post-industrial society. This threatened the very existence of the modern nation-state. End quote. Today, we may know this system by another name, globalization. In many respects, this conscious disintegration may have started with the oil shocks of the early 1970s. Though OPEC's decision to raise the price of petroleum did lasting damage to global economies such as Japan, it also secretly set into motion the power of the petrodollar. Because suddenly, what every industrialized nation on Earth badly needed was oil, and the only currency OPEC would trade it for was, and remains, the American dollar. So how do all these things relate together? The rise of credit debt, institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, climate change, and the petrodollar? Well, it's a bit labyrinthine, but let's try to explain. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, is a financial body connected to the World Bank. Both were formed by the Bretton Woods Conference at the end of World War II. Officially, their function is promoting international development and aiding developing countries on their way to modernization. Unofficially, they've been used over the decades since the switch from the gold standard in America to the petrodollar to keep the global economy going by way of so-called petrodollar recycling. When the price of oil rose in the 1970s, as it also did in the early 21st century, it ate up the budgets of poorer countries. Those countries now needed loans. Meanwhile, oil-rich OPEC nations like Saudi Arabia were flush with cash. In exchange for American assistance in building Saudi Arabia's infrastructure in the 1970s, the Saudis deposited much of their surplus money gained from the higher prices into American and other foreign banks. Through the IMF, some of this money, denominated, I should stress, in US dollars, was then loaned to those oil-starved nations with interest, and at interest rates that would rapidly raise through the 1980s. These countries immediately then turned around and used their loans to do what else but buy more oil. And so the IMF's oil facility system of recycling petrodollars was born, and that would become a major method the American government and its establishment would use to get the rest of the world to finance America's deficits. That allows the American public and the American government to spend and print money without consequence. As Varoufakis writes, the plan was continually, quote, running up boundless deficits and thus to entrench further U.S. hegemony, not in spite of, but because of its deficit position, end quote. Though this plan involved a disintegration of the global economy, it all came back together to center on Wall Street and the global authority and primacy of the US dollar. By the end of the 20th century, thanks to rising international interest rates, much of the developing world had sold off its public assets and natural resources to private Western companies, some of them oil companies, all in order to repay Western banks for loans, many of which were taken out to pay for oil. Debt now makes the world go round. Theoretical money, virtual money, rather than actual wealth. This is what caused the 2008 recession, this virtual currency of debt. And in many ways, as I hope I've made clear, this also dramatically precipitated the growth of climate change. And thanks to the nature of the beast, debt is a kind of death spiral today, trapping us in its vicious circle of a foregone future, predetermining the shape of the world to come, no differently than the Patriots intend in MGS2.
You want to control human thought? Human behavior?
Of course. Anything can be quantified nowadays.
In a way, from the beginning, America has always been defined by the practice of world trade. And the creation of the New York stock market wasn't long after independence. The original, literal Wall Street featured a barricade built by the Dutch to keep out natives. It was here, at such a place of pregnant symbolism, that American finance was born. Wall Street remains the beating heart of American capitalism, even as it is transformed by the advent of AI and the internet. At the time of MGS2's development, there was the so-called dot-com bubble, This overconfidence in the profitability of online companies precipitated the stock market crash of 2001, as much as the 9/11 terror attacks. This new post-Bretton Woods, post-gold standard system was how America would finance its own deficits without spending, taxing, or diminishing in power. It would be how Ronald Reagan in the 1980s could somehow hugely balloon the defense budget while slashing taxes for the wealthy. One could even argue this emerging financial paradigm was tantamount to reverse socialism, a redistribution of wealth out of the hands of the have-nots into the hands of the haves. Meanwhile, economists like Milton Friedman and academics like Francis Fukuyama began to argue as the Cold War was ending that human nature is inherently and uniquely suited to laissez-faire capitalism, never mind the existence of a globe-spanning socioeconomic system that predetermined every outcome. The public was led to believe in this modern economic model, which took as a given human nature is inherently greedy, and that any attempt to constrain its excesses would lead to the curtailment of liberties. The pursuit of profit at all costs has, since the Second World War, tethered together America and despotic Middle Eastern states with abundant oil reserves, such as Saudi Arabia. Naturally, this has provoked a fair deal of terrorism. The idea that any value or priority above profit should be valued has created our world, a world that is more economically and culturally decentralized and disintegrated in the 21st century than ever. It is an oceanic world where events are untethered from their actual explanations, as the masses, high on technology, wildly speculate and fantasize, not even realizing all the things they're taking as a given, all the things they don't and maybe categorically cannot know, all the turtles that go in an infinite regress all the way down. Such a technologically driven, globalized world cannot help but run on oil. How else can world trade, the very lifeblood of post-industrial society, continue? The same is no less true of its other life source, information. The information age has brought the entire vast expanse of human intellectual activity and pursuit onto a single interchangeable medium. Today, there is only data, there is only content. The activity of human thought has itself become no less disintegrated and decentralized than that of economics. America has created in reverse fashion from its historical origins a new world for everyone else. An exported new world, a new future. It's not for nothing that MGS2 used the promo image of an infant and themed itself around Rosemary's pregnancy. This to some extent symbolized the new world that had been incubating for decades and was finally being born as the 21st century. All of this was subtly evoked by this image MGS2 used both in promos and on the pause screen inside Arsenal gear, the world serpent and world turtle of Hindu myth, as detailed in an 1822 work of Orientalism by Niklas Müller. Shesa, the world snake, is the very limit of the knowable universe in that myth system, as the promo poster declares, drawing a link between Shesha and the famous snake from memes made during the American Revolution. Only the snake builds a new world. Sons of Liberty was released in the year of the snake, 2001, at the start of a new century and on, no less, a new and revolutionary game system. The PS2 itself somewhat anticipated the total conversion of all distinct forms of media onto a single medium as the first game console that could, apart from games, also play music and movies. The Hindu world turtle, in turn, inspired the hexagonal design motifs and sense of the subterranean that we see inside Arsenal gear. Booms and busts, oil spills and terror attacks. These have, in the early 21st century, become so routine as to be considered inevitable. The idea it can ever be any other way is for many almost unthinkable. So what will happen if our present model of globalized petro-political capitalism continues to wreak its impact on the environment? Well, I'll end by quoting at length from our final warning. As you are hearing these words, quote, "We are already living in a world 1 degree warmer than the one inhabited by our parents and grandparents. 2 degrees Celsius, which will stress human societies and destroy many natural ecosystems such as rainforests and coral reefs, looms on the near horizon. At 3 degrees, I now believe that the stability of human civilization will be seriously imperiled, while at 4 degrees, a full-scale global collapse of human societies is probable, accompanied by a mass extinction of the biosphere that will be the worst on Earth for tens or even hundreds of millions of years. By 5 degrees, we will see massive positive feedbacks coming into play, driving further warming and climate impacts so extreme that they will leave most of the globe biologically uninhabitable, with humans reduced to a precarious existence in small refuges. At 6 degrees, we risk triggering a runaway warming process that could render the biosphere completely extinct and forever destroy the capacity of this planet to support life." End quote.
Without free will, there is no difference between submission and rebellion. My only real choice is to put an end to this charade. Let me at least have the freedom to end it myself.
We're not in this to make a name for ourselves.
Then what are you and Otacon fighting for?
The future. You can stop being part of a mistake, starting now.
We need to face reality. Our current status quo is itself a kind of toxic oil spill. We need to have faith in a future that's liberated from the petrodollar and that holds predatory or exploitative companies and organizations responsible, that abandons sheer profit-making as the one and only cardinal value. Most of all, we need to reckon with our own sins and figure out what's actually worth passing on and preserving. Don't let our lingering mark on the world be an oil stain. If we don't actively alter our lifestyles and demand our leaders to act more responsibly, there won't be a future in which our legacies can live on. You can stop being part of a mistake starting now. The future is in our hands. Until next time, boss.